Welcome to Project Bonapartist, a unrealistic scenario where Napoleon wins the Napoleonic Wars. I recommend you go check out the first episode on the top right here if you want to get full context on how Napoleon has won the Napoleonic Wars. This episode will explore the geopolitical situation of the world after this Napoleonic victory. So without wasting any of your guys' time, let's get into the episode. Starting with the United States, they have become more powerful than they were historically after the Napoleonic Wars because they've just expanded westward a few decades earlier than our own timeline. Well, this will cause political instability in the new American empire due to two political parties, the less popular, somewhat pro-British Federalists, which, surprise, surprise, advocated for a strong federal government, and the more popular pro-French Democratic Republicans, which advocated for states' rights and the weakening of the federal government. Historically, after the War of 1812, the Federalists have basically collapsed, with the Democratic Republicans dominating the next elections in the United States. In this timeline, though, due to the Anglo-Canadians and the Russian Alaskans in the new American state, this could cause the Federalists to gain more popularity, especially due to their somewhat pro-British stance, and especially because the Anglo-Canadians are still very loyal to Britain. So the Federalists will have to make concessions to its new Anglo-Canadians and Russian Alaskan populations. In terms of the Democratic Republicans, though, since America has gotten much of the Western Caribbean, I could see the Democratic Republican Party expanding to the Caribbean, especially because most of the Democratic Republican support base was located in the South, and you know what the Southerners love to do, they love to enslave the minorities, and due to their new Caribbean holdings, they could expand slavery into the Caribbean, and the Democratic Republicans could gain support from the new southern population there. Down south, we have the Spanish and Portuguese governments in exile. The people in these two governments in exile have mixed opinions about the situation right now. Some like this new situation because this will make Ferdinand VII of Spain and John VI of Portugal's rule over those colonies more legitimate compared to Joseph Bonaparte of Iberia, while others don't like this because their colonial overlords are now directly ruling them, and this will cause discontent throughout Latin America and would cause some of these regions to declare independence later throughout the series. Moving on to the Middle East, we got Egypt. Egypt, they're doing fairly well under Muhammad Ali. No, not that Muhammad Ali, this Muhammad Ali. Pasha, who's now the Sultan of Egypt, and under Muhammad Ali, the Egyptians have controlled many Mesopotamian/Arab tribes in the east of the Middle East, and lightly influencing Kurdistan, Armenia, and Georgia. It's an understatement saying that Egypt is just a regional Middle Eastern power. I mean, they kind of are, but you get the point. Now moving on to Russia. Russia is in a very bad situation right now. Since the overthrow of Alexander I in 1812, Russia has been in chaos, with many local nobilities and military officers governing their respective regions. The current Republican Russian government only has real control over Moscow and some surrounding areas. That's it. The rest is controlled by either a noble family or a military officer. This will cause many regions in Russia to be influenced by other powers like France, China, the British, etc., starting what many historians call the Scramble of Russia. The British government in exile currently supports the Republican Russian government, seeing it as a counterweight against Napoleonic power in Europe. Qing dynasty has influenced many Siberian nobilities, causing much of Siberia to be under Chinese control, and France has influenced many western regions of Russia, causing regions like Belarus and the Black Sea to be influenced by France. Next, we have the British government in exile. They're doing decently well so far. Unlike the Spanish and Portuguese governments in exile, where they contain many disloyal territories, a majority of the people in Australia and New Zealand came from Britain, so they're bound to be loyal to the British nation. The British plan on retaking their lost lands, not just in Europe, but also in Canada and the entire world, and maybe getting some concessions here and there. But they plan on setting their sights on India first, and then expanding the rest of their empire. And lastly, we have France. they're doing the most well out of every single nation I've listed here so far. They've got the entirety of Europe under their control, under the United Napoleonic Empire of Europe, or just Napoleonic Europe for short. Scotland, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Prussia, the Ottoman state, and Egypt aren't officially part of Napoleonic Europe because they're not ruled by Napoleon or one of his relatives, but they are close collaborators of this new European order to not get partitioned by France and their allies. I mean, we all know what happened to Austria, Britain, Spain, Russia, Portugal, and the Ottoman Empire, right? France is currently the largest economy on earth because of their holdings in India and the Caribbean, and they're also the most powerful country on earth due to Napoleon's mass influence in not just in Europe, but also in the entire world, influencing many states along their way. Now we move on to 1816, where the United States presidential election happens between James Monroe of the Democratic Republican Party and Rufus King of the Federalist Party. In our own timeline, James Monroe beat out Rufus King, causing the eventual collapse of the Federalist Party in 1828 due to their mass unpopularity due to their stance on the War of 1812. But in this timeline, due to the new Anglo-Canadian and Russian-Alaskan populations being added, Federalist support base was mostly located in the North, and that the North was more populous than the South. I could see the Federalists coming on top, so making the Federalist Party survive for a few more years or even decades. This would cause a temporary stain in Franco-American relations due to the Federalists' somewhat pro-British stance at the time, but I don't see France and America becoming rivals anytime soon, yet. Moving on down south to the Spanish and Portuguese governments in exile, we see the first rebellions break out, with most of them being in Colombia, since they're the first nation to declare independence from Spain historically in our timeline. Despite this, most of these rebellions will be unsuccessful due to these rebellions being decentralized and disunited, causing the Spanish government to hold on to their American territories for slightly a bit longer than they did historically. Moving on next door to the Portuguese government in exile, this is not really the case. Since Portugal is weaker than Spain and always has been, they would be less capable of putting down these Brazilian rebellions, causing Brazil to eventually gain independence. Well, sort of. The Portuguese government in exile would rename itself from the Portuguese government in exile to the Empire of Brazil, and that the state will be a constitutional monarchy. It would give lots of power to the Brazilian parliament and people. This will make King John VI of Portugal become Emperor John I of Brazil. Moving on to the Anatolian Peninsula, many people in the new Ottoman state would rebel against the Ottoman Sultan due to their humiliating loss against France a few years prior. Due to Napoleonic support to the Ottoman state, these rebellions would be crushed by the Franco-Ottoman armies. Moving on north to Russia, Sweden starts to get involved in this scramble, with them gaining lots of influence over Finnish Karelia and the Kola Peninsula, with plans on directly annexing it into the Swedish Empire. A few years later, in the 1820s, many American settlers start to move out north and west to Canada, Alaska, and most importantly, the sparsely populated northern Spanish territories. This will cause tensions between the Spanish government in exile and the United States, but due to America's ties with France and Napoleonic support to the United States, the Spanish government in exile would be forced to back down, causing more discontent in their new, unstable state. Nothing too drastic would happen until we reach the 1830s, since Napoleon was living in better living conditions than in our own timeline due to being victorious in the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon could live up to his 60s or even 70s. Around the early to mid 1830s though, Napoleon would die due to old age or something. You might think that this wouldn't be a big deal, right? Since he has a son creatively named Napoleon II who could just succeed Napoleon in his empire, but no. Historically, in our own timeline, in July 11th, 1832, Napoleon II died due to tuberculosis, which is caused due to overexertion, which is using too much physical force. I'd still expect Napoleon II to get tuberculosis and die around the same time his father, Napoleon I, did. So, this will cause a very huge succession crisis in France. Many liberals in Europe support his cousin Louis Napoleon to become the next emperor of France, due to him being a bit more liberal compared to the rest of his family, and that he historically made many changes to France, like social and economic reforms, and expanded the railway system, which would be very useful for France. While many conservatives at first supported his uncle Joseph Bonaparte, the current king of Iberia, as the next emperor of France, due to him having more experience in ruling a nation, and since that he was the head of the House of Bonaparte at the time. But this will make France and Iberia way too powerful, so these European conservatives would start supporting his other brother and Louis Napoleon's father, Louis Bonaparte, for practically the same reasons why many conservatives at first supported Joseph Bonaparte. Will these two bastions of liberalism and conservatism peacefully resolve their dispute over France, or will France, and by extent Europe as a whole, break down into a massive civil conflict, all because these two candidates right here couldn't figure out who could become the next emperor of France, aka Europe? Find out next time on the third episode of Project Bonapartist. Make sure you guys subscribe to my first channel, which will be in the comments and description down below, and make sure to follow my TikTok and Twitter, which will also be in the description and comments below. This has been Awesome History, and adios, amigos!